When I saw a shape wobbling through the morning fog, my chest locked up because I understood it hadn't come here by accident. I'd driven to the old Moose Creek cabin the night before, planning nothing more heroic than patching its leaking roof and hiding from people for a while. After 40 years as a backcountry ranger, retirement felt too loud. The cabin felt silent in the best possible way. Just me, a thermos of coffee, and the high hush of the Rockies. Dawn spread a thin pearl light across the clearing. I stepped onto the sagging porch boards to test the weather and nearly kicked over my toolbox. That's when the fog opened and there he was. At first I thought he was a grouse. Small, hunched, mottled brown. Then the sunlight nicked one feather and flashed the dark bronze only golden eagles wear. An eaglet no bigger than a house cat, dragging a wing at a helpless angle. He should have bolted. A wounded bird's first law is flee or die. But he didn't budge. He tilted his head, bright eyes locked on mine, as if I were the thing he'd come looking for. I took a step, he took 1-2 toward me. Another step, again he matched me, pausing only to steady the useless wing with his beak. By the time we met in the middle of the clearing, my pulse was rattling like hail on a tin roof. I crouched, palms open. Easy, little fella. His talons clicked once on the grass, but the stare never wavered. No hiss, no flap, no retreat. I slipped my hands around his body, feeling the frantic hammer of his heart, and carried him across the porch threshold. Inside smelled of pine, dust, and stove smoke. I lined an old fruit crate with my jacket and eased him in. He settled, let out a breathy kick that sounded almost relieved. That startled me more than the wound. A wild eagle chick trusting a human? That doesn't happen. I trimmed a strip off my flannel sleeve and jury-rigged a sling to brace the broken wing. He watched every move, eyes bright, unblinking, as though memorizing me. No panic, no fight, just patient concentration, the way a person watches a doctor thread stitches. He didn't beg, I kept telling myself while rummaging for water. He asked without a sound. And the water trembled in the cup because my hands finally started to shake. I found half a trout I'd smoked the week before. Broke it into strips. He accepted the first bite from my fingers, swallowed, then looked up as if to say that's good, but there's something else you need to see. I laughed at the thought, felt foolish, then laughed again because that gaze was so direct I could almost hear a voice behind it. By noon I'd forgotten the roof and every plan I'd carried in. All that mattered was the tiny rise and fall of feathers in the crate and the clock tick of talons on cedar when he shifted position. Outside, the fog lifted into blue sky, but the cabin stayed dim, its windows smeared with years of dust. I leaned against the doorframe, bone-tired, oddly peaceful. 3 hours later, a branch cracked somewhere near the tree line. The eaglet lifted his head sharply, eyes fixed on the doorway. I edged to the window but saw nothing, only sunlight sliding across rust-red pine trunks. The forest was breathing, listening. Something else was out there. The eaglet knew. And his calmness, his utter certainty, sent an unexpected chill up my neck. Night lowered early in the valley. I fed him again, set a lantern on the floor, and stretched out in my sleeping bag a few feet away. Every time the wind stirred, he answered with that soft kick, low and even. Not fear. A signal. Like he was calling coordinates in a language older than the cabin, older than me. Around midnight I woke to silence so complete it rang. The lantern had burned out. Moonlight painted the walls silver. The eaglet sat upright in the crate, staring at the door. I followed his gaze and for a heartbeat thought the shadows were moving. But nothing crossed the threshold, nothing breathed but us. Yet the boy inside me, the one who once believed the woods could speak, heard something pacing just beyond the line where lamplight would have ended. I almost opened the door right then. But the eaglet blinked, slow and certain, and I felt a wordless warning, not yet. Dawn bled pink over the ridge. I brewed coffee, he preened his feathers with meticulous care, and an idea settled on me heavier than the mountains themselves. Maybe I hadn't rescued him at all. Maybe I'd been summoned. The sun climbed, bright and innocent, and I caught myself smiling. Ridiculous, right? A man hauled out of retirement by a bird barely old enough to fly. I shook my head, tightening the last knot on his wing brace. You'll be back in the sky before you know it, partner. He cocked that same wise angle. And for the first time in years I felt like someone believed every promise I made. I stepped outside to fetch fresh water. The clearing sat quiet, almost expectant. The forest edge was darker than I remembered, as though keeping a secret in its pockets. I glanced over my shoulder at the open cabin door and that little figure in the crate. The distance between us suddenly felt fragile as glass. I thought that was the end of it, just a simple act of kindness for a hurt fledgling. I had no idea whom he would bring to my door. He never asked for help. He looked at me as if he already knew I would understand. The eaglet spent that first night tucked inside the fruit crate, wrapped in my flannel like a child in borrowed blankets. He drank in slow, greedy sips whenever I tipped the cup to his beak, then sagged against the boards, each breath rattling as if the whole mountain sat on his chest. I lay 2 yards away, boots still on, listening to the wet scrape of his lungs and wondering how many miles of sky he'd already lost. Around midnight the cabin settled, old logs giving that tired sigh houses make when they remember who built them, and something new stirred outside. A muffled thump. Then another, heavier, like a bowling ball, rolled across pine needles. I killed the lantern and held my own breath. The steps circled once, slow and deliberate, then drifted off toward the timberline. No grunt, no snarl, just weight moving through darkness with purpose. Morning cracked bright and cold. When I opened the door, the world smelled of river. There on the threshold lay a fresh-cut rainbow trout, thick as my forearm, still beaded with water. I hadn't fished. No neighbor lives within 20 miles. Hawks don't leave tribute and coyotes never share. I stared until the coffee in my mug went lukewarm, then carried the fish inside, split it, and fed the eaglet small flakes of pink flesh. He gulped them, feathers trembling, but his eyes kept skating to the doorway as if checking whether his courier had arrived for a tip. That afternoon he tried to stand. The sling held, yet his legs tremored like saplings in wind. When I laid him back down, he threw his head toward the open window and loosed a sharp, rising kick, once, twice, 3 times, each note climbing a step higher, echoing between the ridges. Not distress. A summons. I felt it in my ribs the way a struck bell hums long after the mallet lifts. Dusk bled across the clearing. I hammered a loose shingle, but every swing of the hammer felt smaller than the sound clinging to those trees. Somewhere out there, something was listening. Returning the signal may be too soft for human ears. The second night, the footsteps came earlier. Same slow wait, but now they paused by the porch boards. I eased the rifle from its rack, heart thumping like it wanted out. The steps resumed, once around the walls, then vanished. The eaglet didn't startle. He lifted his head, cocked it, and let one soft chirp float into the dark, almost conversational. I sat awake till dawn, gun across my knees, wondering why I suddenly felt like the least knowledgeable creature in the valley. At first light, I found a second trout, bigger, bright silver, no tooth marks. I cleaned it on the chopping stump while ravens shot me suspicious glances as if I'd stolen their offering. The eaglet ate until his crop bulged, then leaned back and released a single high-pitched cry so pure it felt carved out of crystal. The forest answered with silence so deep it had to be full of meaning. On the third evening, storm clouds bruised the sky purple. I brought in extra firewood, settled the eaglet, and had just latched the door when the night itself seemed to step forward. A shape materialized at the edge of the porch, tall, lean, fur-black as burnt cedar, moonlight combed through with one narrow slash of white along the jaw. A wolf. He didn't growl. Didn't bare teeth. He simply stood, weight-balanced, yellow eyes glowing like tiny campfires. My pulse hammered, every ranger instinct screamed predator. I raised the rifle halfway, then noticed his gaze wasn't on me at all. It cut past my shoulder, straight to the crate where the eaglet waited. The bird answered with a low, steady chirr. The wolf's ears twitched, not back in threat but forward as though catching a familiar voice on the wind. I could have sworn recognition flickered there, something older than fear, older than the hunt. I cleared my throat, a sound far braver than I felt. Easy, boy. The barrel wavered. The wolf blinked, slow, deliberate. Then, with the grace of falling snow, he folded his legs and sat on the top step. And waited. Minutes dragged like hours. Rain started, soft needles on the cedar roof. I could smell his coat, wild sage and river mud. The eaglet shuffled in the crate, never looking away. My arm ached from holding the rifle. I lowered it, breath hitching. I figured a hungry killer had come. But he just sat and waited. The cabin filled with a hum I can't describe, some invisible thread stretched between predator and fledgling, vibrating with memory. The wolf looked not at me, at the eaglet. There was something human in that gaze. Thunder rolled over the ridge. The lantern guttered once, then steadied. Outside, the wolf stayed motionless, sentinel in the storm. Inside, the eaglet's eyes gleamed, not with fear, but with the calm assurance of someone who's finally been found. The wolf came back the very next night, slipping out of the timber like a shadow given its own heartbeat. Same place on the porch. Same polite silence. He sat, watched the eaglet until dawn. Pearl gray spilled behind the peaks, then melted into the trees when the first chickadees started bragging about daylight. I barely slept, waiting for teeth that never flashed. The second night he returned again, paws silent on wet pine needles. No growl, no hunger in his stance. He parked himself 3 steps from the door. Nothing else on earth could have pried him from that post. The eaglet answered with a quiet trill so soft I felt it more in my ribs than in my ears. On the third night the wolf carried something in his jaws. Not a rabbit. Not a bone. A bundle of green, mountain sweetgrass, stems still damp with creek water. He padded up, laid the offering square on the threshold, and backed off to his usual watch spot. I knelt, dumbfounded. Sweetgrass is medicine up here. Eagles nibble it for stomach ache. Old trappers chew it to clear the lungs. Had he scavenged it? No, the roots were clean, the cut fresh, as if he'd chosen the stalks with care. I set 2 stalks in the eaglet's crate. The bird snapped them up, swallowing in neat gulps, then leaned into the corner as if the ache inside him had eased a notch. My jaw floated somewhere down near my boots. The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of the eaglet feeding. That was all, just that tiny, satisfied rustle, yet it brought a calm to his eyes, the way a father settles when a lullaby finally works. Night after night the pattern repeated. Sometimes he arrived with more sweetgrass, sometimes with tufts of yarrow or strips of moist moss the color of emeralds. Not once did he ask for anything in return. He kept to a respectful distance, head high, nose testing the air, shoulders loose but coiled, ready to spring at anything that might threaten the fragile life behind my door. I started leaving the cabin lamp dark, sitting in the gloom where he couldn't see my face clearly, just to watch him through the cracked boards. His body was a map of scars, old knife of a gash along the flank, heel bite mark on the ear. A survivor, no question. Yet the way he settled into guard duty, quiet, deliberate, wasn't predator, wasn't curiosity. It was purpose. One evening an owl swooped low over the porch. The wolf lunged, not to kill but to herd the bird off course, then trotted back to his post without a sound. Another time a porcupine waddled too near. He circled, chuffed once, drove it away, returned to stillness. Every move said, nothing touches the eaglet. I tried reasoning it out. Maybe he'd lost his own pack, imprinted on the eagle's cry. Maybe the scent of blood triggered something strange in his brain. Maybe my favorite theory at 2 in the morning, he was the grown pup I'd saved all those years ago, paying an impossible debt. Each idea felt too small, like pulling a blanket corner over a storm. And always that question looped back, who are you, old boy? Why stay? On the 7th night, I eased onto the stoop while he was there, coffee steaming in my hand. He tensed but didn't rise. Moonlight threw silver bars across his muzzle. I spoke low, like greeting an armed stranger at your gate. You didn't come for me, did you? He blinked, slow, deliberate. My words came out a whisper. You came for him. The wolf's tail thumped once, dusty pine needles puffing. Confirmation? Coincidence? My heart believed the first option long before my head permitted it. At dawn he disappeared again, but something in the clearing felt newly stitched, threads binding wolf, man, and eaglet into one improbable fabric. I cleaned the crate, checked the sling, offered more water. The eaglet's breathing had smoothed almost to normal. The light in his eyes looked brighter than the sunrise itself. Standing there, I felt the size of what was happening tower over me. A wild wolf feeding medicine to an injured eagle chick, keeping watch all night like a veteran sentry. I'd cataloged thousands of animal behaviors in my ranger logs, but this belonged in no book. I thought it was just a free quirk of nature. But the truth ran deeper, like a river under ice. He didn't come for food. He came for him. I spent the next morning sawing rotten rafters, but every scrape of the blade kept dragging up the same memory, one I hadn't touched in 2 decades. 20 years back, before retirement and bad knees, I'd been called to a logging road just north of here. A pair of weekend hunters had cornered a wolf pup under a culvert, claimed it was disease-ridden vermin, and meant to finish the job with A.30-06. The pup couldn't have weighed 20 pounds, all legs and ears, coal-black except for a thin milk-white dash under the jaw, like a careless smear of paint. I talked the men down, wrapped the pup in my coat, and drove through the night to release him on the far side of Winter Ridge, far enough, I'd hoped, that no rifle report would ever reach him again. I watched him limp into the trees, turned the truck around, and told myself a ranger's good deed ends the moment the taillights fade. I hadn't thought about that drive in years until this wolf started showing up at my porch. Could it possibly be him? My brain shook its head. Wolves in the wild live 8, maybe 10, sometimes 12 if the winters are merciful. 20 is fantasy. Besides, the pup had been jet black all over, a glossy chunk of midnight. This one wore a distinct ivory streak along his lower jaw, a badge he carried like rank. Different animal. Had to be. But my heart kept whispering traitorous questions. That first night on the porch I'd spotted a faint scar on the wolf's left flank, the same spot where the pup had taken a hunter's ricochet. And those eyes, liquid amber, unafraid, felt like déjà vu every time they fixed on me. Doubt climbed my spine and nested there, warm and persistent. That evening he arrived earlier than usual, stepping from the pines while the sun still tangled in the branches. No herbs carried tonight, no trout, just himself. He halted at the bottom step as always, but when I eased onto the stoop, he didn't retreat. I set the coffee mug aside, palms visible, voice low. "You remember me, don't you?" The words sounded ridiculous in open air. He took one deliberate pace forward, timber creaking under his weight, until only 2 yards separated us. His nostrils fluttered, tasting the space between man and beast. I swear the clearing tilted, the rest of the world slid off somewhere beyond the tree line. Close up, the white slash under his jaw glowed like moon on snow. My pulse jumped. The pup smear had been smaller, but right there, same angle. I reached without thinking, slow, stopping inches from his muzzle. He didn't flinch. Instead, he met my gaze the way old friends sometimes do when words have become unnecessary. And in that moment, every neatly labeled fact in my head, lifespan, coat color, common sense, crumbled under a single impossible certainty: it's him. Wind rattled the cedars. The eaglet, tucked in his crate just inside the door, chirred once, soft, trusting. The wolf's ear flicked toward the sound, then back to me. He hadn't come for scraps, hadn't come to scavenge. He'd come to stand guard for the bird and somehow for me. Can an animal remember a face after 20 winters? Science says no. But science has never knelt on a porch at dusk while a wild wolf reads your soul like Braille. I exhaled the breath I didn't realize I was holding. "You grew tall, old boy." My voice cracked like a sapling in frost. From habit more than need, I motioned toward the water pan I'd left near the steps. He ignored it, attention fixed on my eyes as though searching for the ranger who once freed him from a culvert. He looked at me as if I were one of his own. I don't know how long we stayed locked in that quiet vow. The mountains faded to silhouettes, bats stitched the first stars across the sky. At length he turned, padded back down the steps, and melted into the shadows, the clearing swallowing him without a sound. I stood there long after he vanished, hands trembling like green twigs, while the night pressed close, thick with wonder and questions too large for language. If he hadn't come back the next night, I might have chalked the whole thing up to frontier loneliness and moonlit imagination. But the next night was waiting to prove me wrong. The fifth night started like the others, waxing moon, hush of pines, but the wolf crossed a line he'd never crossed before. Instead of planting himself on the bottom step, he padded all the way up and curled right across the threshold, big shoulders wedged against the jamb. One heavy sigh, paws crossed, chin on them like an old farm dog. He wasn't visiting anymore, he'd declared residency. I sat on the floorboards a few feet inside, the eaglet dozing in his crate between us. The cabin lantern burned low, throwing gold bands over fur and feathers alike. My pulse steadied for the first time in days. Whatever storm had tied us together, it felt, for one fragile hour, like the world had finally quit spinning. Around midnight a high, needling howl sliced the stillness. Then another, closer. Coyotes plural, restless, hungry. The wolf's head snapped up, mine did too. I set the lantern on a crate lid and reached for the old Winchester I kept propped by the doorframe. The barrel felt cold, alien, almost embarrassing when laid alongside the calm certainty in his eyes. The coyotes sang again, maybe 200 yards out, threading through the timber where moonlight never touched. Shadows moved between shadows. I pumped around into the chamber. The clack echoed louder than any howl. The eaglet stirred, clicking his beak, the sound tiny but brave. The wolf rose, muscles rolling under the dark pelt, and stepped off the porch, no snarl, no show of teeth. He stopped 10 paces out, planted himself square between the cabin and the tree line, tail low, ears forward. A lone sentry on the edge of empire. Another yip burst from the brush, closer this time, testing. The wolf answered with a single chest-deep bark so forceful I felt it in the soles of my feet. Silence. Then rustle, figures pacing just beyond sight, gauging odds. Coyotes aren't foolish, they're opportunists. A wounded eagle chick smells as good as steak to them. But the posture of that wolf, head high, body still, spoke a language every scavenger understands. Try it and bleed. Minutes stretched tight as wire. I kept the rifle trained where shadows thickened, breath measured, heart rioting. The coyotes flirted with the clearing's edge, whined low, shuffled dry needles, then, one by one, the sounds unraveled into distance. Their chorus retreated up valley, swallowed by the ridges. Only when the last echo died did the wolf turn. He glanced at me, not long, just enough, and padded back to the porch. Instead of lying down, he stepped inside, 3 cautious pawfalls over the threshold, and sat beside the crate. The eaglet peered up, offered a soft, throaty chirr. The wolf chuffed once, like a father saying, "Hush now, storm's past." I lowered the rifle, lungs deflating, throat hot with something that wasn't fear anymore. He'd risked his hide for the bird. Or, my mind finally dared the thought, for me too. He risked himself for him. Or for me. Dawn bled pale rose through the window slats. The wolf was gone, left without a sound, leaving only the faint heat his body had pressed into the boards. I knelt to check the eaglet, expecting the usual sluggish lift of his chest. Instead I found him standing, wobbling on stubby talons, slinged wing twitching at the shoulder joint. He gave a startled hop, flapped once, and managed a crooked half-inch rise before wobbling back into the crate. The breath I loosed fogged the air like church incense. I rocked back on my heels, laughing and near tears at the same time. The bird's blood was moving, life pushing outward again. And part of me knew it wasn't just the stitches or the herbs. Something about the wolf's watch had carried weight medicine alone cannot measure. I stepped outside, exhaustion and triumph wrestling in my chest. The clearing looked ordinary, the kind of ordinary that disguises miracles. Not a single paw print lingered in the damp soil, only my own boots and a faint scuff where he'd braced to face the coyotes. As if he'd never been there at all. I figured that was the finale, the eagle safe, the coyotes gone, the guardian's duty honored. Thought they'd won, end of tale. But the wolf hadn't shown me the most important thing yet. Morning broke bright as hammered brass, and the eaglet decided today was the day he'd beat gravity. He crawled out of the crate, talons scraping for purchase, lifted the half-mended wing and pumped, once, twice, feathers slapping air like wet canvas. For half a breath he hovered a finger's width above the floorboard. Then the broken pinion faltered and he tumbled sideways in a flurry of dust and small, furious chirps. I rushed forward, hands outstretched, but he shook me off, dignity wounded deeper than bone. He hobbled to the threshold, stared at the empty clearing as if daring the sky to come closer next time. My chest ached watching that fierce spark trapped inside a body not yet ready. The wolf had spent the night head on paws, amber eyes half closed, listening to every wing beat like a nurse counting heartbeats. At sunrise he rose, gave the eaglet a soft rumble that sounded oddly like encouragement, and trotted into the timber without a backward glance. First time he'd left before dawn. I told myself he was hunting breakfast. But the sun slid west, shadows stretched thin, and dusk settled with no sign of him. One night bled into the next, still no paw prints, no bright eyes at the porch. The clearing felt suddenly enormous, a stage missing its lead actor. The eaglet called 3, 4, 5 times into the dark, high, piercing whistles meant for ridgelines to carry. Only the canyon wind answered back. On the second day, just after noon, the forest exhaled a sound I'd never heard, a low thunder of wings, deep and certain, a heartbeat turned inside out. An adult golden eagle swept over the trees, body longer than my arm's pan, primaries spread wide as barn doors. The bird circled once, sunlight striking bronze sparks off each feather, then folded its sails and dropped into the clearing. I froze halfway to the water barrel, every sense lit up like fuses. The adult touched down 6 feet from the eaglet, talons knitting the earth, head tilted in regal inspection. The eaglet chirred 3 staccato notes I'd come to recognize as greeting. The adult answered with a single, resonant click of its beak, the sound of flint striking steel. They knew each other. Somehow, impossibly, they knew. Before my brain could catch up, a dark figure eased from the tree line, my wolf, padding slow, eyes on the 2 birds. He came no closer, only sat, chest heaving from what must have been a hard run across valleys I couldn't name. His gaze flicked to me just long enough to pin my heart in place, then returned to his charges. "How did you find him?" The words scraped out, half prayer, half accusation. "How did you know?" The wolf said nothing, he'd already delivered his answer in feathers and living proof. The adult stepped forward, nudged the eaglet's sling with that lethal beak, testing strength. The eaglet braced, lifted both wings, one steady, one trembling, while the larger bird spread its own in a slow, deliberate fan, A lesson without words. This is what tomorrow looks like. The eaglet mirrored the motion as best he could. My throat tightened until breathing felt optional. Minutes passed, maybe hours, time puddled between wing beats. Eventually the adult hopped to the porch rail and settled, sentinel and teacher all at once. The wolf curled at the bottom step, tail covering his paws, gaze softening into something that looked dangerously like pride. I swear the air itself thickened with meaning, as though the valley had been waiting its whole life for this exact alignment of claw and paw and humbled man. I inched backward into the cabin, afraid a single wrong sound might snap the spell. The eaglet didn't notice. Every atom of him pointed toward the larger bird. Guidance flowed between them in a language older than weather. And over it all loomed that single impossible question looping in my skull. How could a wolf track down an eagle across mountain ranges? How had he known which cry in the sky belonged to this chick? By sunset the adult launched skyward, a bronze flare against indigo, circled twice, and vanished beyond the ridge. The wolf rose, gave the eaglet one last measuring look as if confirming the lesson had taken, then melted into the timber the same way night slips into a room when you blow the lamp out. I stood alone on the porch, knees weak, soul roaring. I had thought rescuing a crippled bird and befriending a lone wolf was the ceiling of wonder. I thought I had seen everything, but nature was only beginning to show me the truth. Dawn pried the night open with a single golden blade, and the eaglet answered. He hopped from the crate to the porch rail, first time he'd dared that height, balanced, shook his feathers into place, and looked straight at the wolf as if asking permission. The wolf gave nothing more than a calm blink, but something in the set of his ears said now. The eaglet crouched, pumped both wings. Cloth sling fluttered, feathers hissed. He rose a foot, wobbled, came down hard. I lurched forward, then forced myself still. Too much help and he'd never leave. He tried again. This time he cleared a yard, hung there, body trembling like a compass needle caught between north and destiny. Air bucked beneath him, he fought it, climbed another foot. 2 full meters of impossible. My lungs forgot the sequence for breathing. The wolf stayed planted at the bottom step, amber eyes reflective as creek water, recording every heartbeat of ascent. I felt his tension more than saw it, muscles poised, yet utterly silent, the way a priest watches a baptism. The eaglet flailed once, talons clawing at nothing, balance slipping. A cry ripped from his throat, sharp, panicked. Before gravity could claim him, a shadow thundered overhead. The adult eagle, bronze and immaculate, dropped from the blue like a blessing, wings spread to catch the fledgling on a cushion of wind. One powerful downdraft steadied the youngster, another lifted both birds together in a spiral of sunlight and whirling down feathers. They climbed above the treetops, circling, the larger bird adjusting angles so the smaller could feel each contour of the wind. Higher, over the ridge where morning burned the snowcaps pink. My eyes stung, partly from looking into the glare, mostly from the surge of something too wide for words. Beside me, the wolf never shifted. He tracked them across the sky until they were 2 sparks flickering against the raw blue, until even those sparks vanished beyond the tallest peak. Only then did his ears relax, sliding back in what looked unmistakably like contentment. I finally exhaled, the sound shaking loose from somewhere below my ribs. "You did it," I whispered, not sure if I meant the bird, the wolf, or some larger grace binding the two. He flicked an ear at my voice but kept his gaze pinned to the last place the eagles had glimmered. I followed the line of his sight. Empty sky, roaring with absence, and felt a swell of gratitude so fierce it bordered on pain. I saw how he looked at the heavens, and in that look there was happiness. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The wolf stood as though carved from the same basalt as the peaks. I waited beside him, afraid any motion might crack the china-thin hush holding the world together. Finally he turned, padded down the steps, and paused at the edge of the clearing. Muscles bunched as if he were deciding between directions written in a language only mountains read. I thought that was the curtain drop, guardian released, story wrapped. I thought, well, that's the end of it. But he came back. 2 sunsets later, I was splitting kindling when the forest doorway opened and the wolf trotted into the light. No herbs, no trout. He carried only himself and something new in his posture. A looseness, almost playful. He stopped 6 feet away, lowered his head in a small, deliberate nod. Not subservience. Acknowledgement. The kind travelers trade when their roads finally diverge. I set the hatchet down, step hesitant. "You checking on me, old friend?" My voice cracked. He blinked, slow, that familiar gesture of understanding, then swung toward the timber, tail swishing once like a final brushstroke on a finished painting. This time he didn't look back. Branches parted around him, swallowed black fur, and the forest closed silent as a secret. I stood alone, wind tugging my sleeves, heart loud enough to scare birds from a mile away. Above the ridge, two distant specks traced lazy loops against the horizon. Bronze tethered to bronze, apprentice following master's invisible script. I raised a hand in reflex, as if they could see, as if waving might matter. Maybe it did. I gathered the broken sling from the porch rail and folded it into my pocket. The cabin felt enormous without feathers rustling in the corner, without soft paws settling at the threshold. But the emptiness wasn't loss. It was a room newly prepared for whatever mystery chose to visit next. Because now I knew, the wild keeps its own ledgers. Debts carry across seasons, across species, across decades. And sometimes, if you're very quiet, you get to watch one small line balanced in full, right in your own front yard. I turned toward the tool shed, mind already rehearsing repairs that suddenly seemed less urgent than before. The mountains breathed, the sky opened wide, and somewhere beyond the ridge an eaglet rode the wind he'd been born to claim, while a lone wolf, miles below, padded beneath the pines content to walk the world a shade lighter. The clearing stayed empty for 2 full dawns. No black silhouette against the tree line, no soft pant of breath outside the threshold. The hush felt heavier than any howl. I kept scanning the ridge anyway, telling myself he'd earned the right to disappear. Still, the cabin boards creaked with a loneliness I hadn't felt since the day I first locked its door 20 years ago. On the 3rd morning I stepped out early, coffee steaming white in the chill. A thin fog clung to the grass. My boot hit something metallic, small, solid, half buried in needles. I knelt, brushed aside dew-wet duff, and the world narrowed to a single glint of steel. A folding knife, staghorn handle worn smooth, brass bolsters dulled by time. Across the butt plate a faint engraving caught the light. JT. Keep the faith. My initials. A gift from my father the year I took the Ranger oath. I'd lost it 2 decades earlier on the far side of Winter Ridge, the same night I'd carried a half-dead wolf pup wrapped in my coat. I remember searching frantically in the beam of a flashlight, cursing the darkness, finally giving up when dawn pinked the granite. That knife had lain somewhere in those woods all this time, or so I believed until it winked at me from my own doorstep. I turned it over, throat tightening. Sap still filmed the hinge, pine resin so fresh it hadn't hardened. Someone or something had unearthed it recently, and walked who knows how many ridges to place it here, precisely where my foot would find it. He remembered. The realization hit harder than any rifle recoil. Only one creature knew both the knife and this porch. The pup I'd freed, now grown into the guardian who watched an eaglet heal. My knees gave, dropping me to the step. Fog beaded on my lashes while the knife blurred in my palm. All those nights he'd sat silent, nose lifted, ears swiveling to the eaglet's rasping wings. He'd also been weighing a debt none of us had known remained unpaid. And when the bird was safe, when the sky had reclaimed its own, he trekked back to the place of our first meeting, found the shard of metal I'd mourned and carried it home across ravines and talus fields. Wolves cache food, not keepsakes. But this wasn't for him. It was currency in a ledger older than language. I wiped the blade on my sleeve, opened it, the action still buttersmooth, and then closed it with a snap that echoed like a heartbeat. Thank you, I whispered into the fog, unsure which direction carried my words to the right ears. A squirrel scolded overhead. A jay flashed blue between trees. Otherwise, silence. No paw prints in the damp soil, no tuft of black fur snagged on bark. The wilderness keeps its secrets clean. I slipped the knife into my pocket, weight warm against the thigh, and felt something settle in my chest, not closure exactly, but an exquisite fullness, like the moment a long-held note resolves into harmony. They remember. And they repay. I stood there until the sun shook the last shreds of mist off the spruce needles. Work waited, roof planks to nail, water barrels to patch, but the usual urgency was gone. Every tick of the clock felt like borrowed grace. That evening I built a small fire in the yard, laid a strip of smoked venison beside it. Not bait, an offering of gratitude given back. I sat until the flames guttered down to ember. No eyes flashed from the dark. The meat cooled. I left it anyway. Inside, the cabin loomed quiet but no longer lonely. The crate sat folded in the corner, feathers swept away, sling washed and hung like a retired medal. I placed the knife on the windowsill where moonlight could polish the brass, then climbed into my bunk and let sleep take me under like a gentle tide. I thought that was the final chapter, debt settled, circle closed. But just before dawn I woke, stepped onto the porch and looked up. High above the valley, two eagles rode a spiral of pink dawn light, one broad-winged and regal, one smaller, steadier with every stroke. And far below, at the shadowed edge of the meadow, a lone black figure stood, head tipped skyward, watching his proteges stitch the clouds. I raised a hand, heart rattling against bone. He turned, met my gaze across the silver grass, and in that instant the distance between man and wolf collapsed into silent understanding. Then he slipped back into the timber, leaving only the echo of his gratitude stamped across an endless sky. They remember. And they give thanks. When the calendar tipped past 4 silent weeks, I almost convinced myself the valley had closed the ledger for good. The roof was fixed, the woodpile high, and the knife sat on the sill like a keepsake from some wilder life. But every morning I still angled my coffee toward the empty sky, hoping for bronze wings against the slate-blue peaks and trying to ignore how much hope hurt. The 5th Sunday dawned cloudless, air so clean it felt new-minted. I stepped outside and the world held its breath, even the creek seemed to hush its chatter. Then a shadow rippled across the clearing, broad, steady, unmistakable. A full-grown golden eagle coasted down the valley and, with a single majestic sweep, settled on the peak of my cabin roof. Wood creaked under talons, sunlight struck his feathers, turning each filament to hammered copper. He didn't call, didn't shift. He just looked, down the slope of shingles, through the curl of smoke from my chimney, straight into my eyes. I froze on the porch step, heartbeat ticking loud enough to measure time. I'd seen wildlife stare before, challenge, curiosity, fear, but never whatever poured out of that gaze. It was closer to recognition, as if we shared a memory etched deeper than instincts could explain. Minutes stretched thin as fishing line. I should have felt small under that raptor's royalty, instead an odd calm flooded my chest. I managed a whisper. "You made it, kid." The eagle's head tilted at the sound of my voice, and the sun caught the faint scar where a sling once rubbed his shoulder. Same bird. No question. I thought he might launch right then, but instead he ducked, spread his wings half open, the motion slow, ceremonial, before folding them tight again. A gesture so deliberate it felt like a bow. My throat closed. Gratitude, plain as daylight, beamed from a creature that owed me nothing. The wind rustled through the aspens, carrying the hush of a chapel. He held the lock of that gaze a moment longer, then beat his wings once, twice, lifted clear of the roof in a flurry of glittering bronze, and arrowed upward above the treetops where the valley's silence finally cracked into the wild exclamation of his cry. It echoed off granite in 3 bright notes, then faded into the ceiling of the sky. I watched until the last fleck vanished against the sun. Only then did I notice the weight of stillness gathering at the tree line. A shape stepped from the pines, black as midnight, white/bright beneath the jaw, the wolf. He stood on the edge of shadow, legs long and straight, head high. Not approaching, not retreating. Simply being there, as if to underline what had just happened. My heart kicked hard. We hadn't seen each other in a month, yet nothing about him looked uncertain. He glanced once toward the patch of sky where the eagle had disappeared, then back to me. No wag, no whine, no need for motion. Just that steady amber gaze that had shepherded a wounded bird to flight and a wounded man to understanding. A breeze lifted the fur along his shoulders. Gold-green light flickered through spruce branches and flamed across his eyes. Something inside me cracked wider than fear or awe. Some inner door to a room I didn't know existed until he opened it. Every mile of mountain in my ranger days, every note in every field journal, suddenly seemed like small talk next to the conversation happening in that wordless stare. He held it for 3 breaths. Then he turned, so smoothly the grass barely swayed, and melted back into the timber. No crunch of needles, no flash of tail. Just gone. As though the forest had always been missing that one piece and was now complete. I stayed rooted to the porch, evening sliding its long blue shadows past my boots. feeling the earth's slow spin in my bones. A hawk cried far off. Somewhere deeper in the woods a branch snapped, maybe under paw, maybe under hoof. I couldn't tell and didn't need to. The wild had spoken its final sentences. Interpretation was mine to carry from here. I closed my eyes, let the silence settle like dust on a shelf, and felt the truth ring through me. Quiet, unstoppable, perfectly clear. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'd never have believed it. But now I know in the wild there is more than strength. There is memory. There is gratitude. There is soul. If your heart is trembling with reverence right now, if you believe animals remember kindness, type, nature is wiser than us. When I heard that thick, sucking sound out in the marsh, my breath froze in my chest because I knew this wasn't a fish stirring the water and it sure wasn't one of my nets snapping back. Somebody out there was calling for help and they were sinking fast. It was still the silver edge of dawn. Mist rolled low, clinging to the reeds the way quiet clings to an empty church. I'd shuffled down the dock barefoot like I always do, half asleep, half praying the crabs hadn't chewed through my lines overnight. A gull croaked once, then even he went silent, as though nature herself was holding her tongue. Then came that faint cry, a wet, broken, swallowed by the fog. My first thought was a raccoon caught in a crayfish trap. Second thought, maybe a young buck mired in the mudflats. I grabbed my old 12-gauge anyway, more out of habit than bravery, and followed the sound into the sawgrass. Another slurp, another muffled groan. My heart hammered like it wanted out of my ribs. The marsh smelled of rotten eggs and cold iron. Every step felt borrowed from a nightmare. I parted a veil of cattails, and there he stood. A wild boar. Big as a refrigerator, bristle black, but for a white scar across his snout. He was crouched on the very rim of a peat sink, shoulders heaving, hoofs slick with muck. And he wasn't running from me. He wasn't even looking at me. He was staring straight down into the hole where that desperate cry kept bubbling up. For a heartbeat my legs locked. Boars kill people down here, they gore first and wonder later. Instinct barked, back up, old man. Back up slow. But something in the way that animal moved, jerky, frantic, almost pleading, made me stay. He plunged his snout into the sludge, grunted, backed out, tried again. Each time he yanked upward, a chunk of sod came free, but whatever lay beneath stayed stuck. The pig snapped his jaws, frustrated, and let out a roar so raw it rattled my fillings. Then the sound I'll never forget. A human moan, thin as fishing line, winding up through the mud. A man was down there. My spine went numb. Still the boar ignored me. He slid one hoof forward, almost toppled in, then braced and tried to dig with a foreleg, flinging clods behind him. I saw a sleeve blue denim, soaked black, surface for a blink before sinking again. The pig lunged, caught that cloth in his tusks, and pulled with every ounce of muscle the Lord had given him. He ain't looking at me, I whispered, too shocked to shout. He's looking at what's got his heart deeper than any man with a gun ever could. He wasn't looking at me. He kept staring down at something that mattered to him more than a man with a shotgun. Time broke loose inside my skull. I crashed through the reeds, dropped the gun, and threw myself flat on the bank beside him. The earth quivered under the boar's weight. His hot breath steamed against my ear, but he didn't snap, didn't shy. He tugged. I grabbed the man's wrist, slick, cold, and frighteningly limp, and together, beast and I, we hauled. The mud fought back like a jealous lover. A boot surfaced, then a knee. The boar braced, muscles bunching. I dug my heels, feeling the peat suck at my ankles. One last heave, something tore, the earth belched, and the man slid out onto the grass, coughing black water. For a second none of us moved. The stranger gasped like a newborn. I could feel his pulse stuttering under my fingers. The boar towered over him, chest heaving, eyes wild, not with rage, but with an urgency I can only call human. Then, as if a switch flipped, the animal backed up 3 careful steps and sat. Sat like an old dog guarding a child's crib. That was the moment my knees gave out. I dropped beside the man, shouted into the fog for help that might never come, and looked the boar full in the face. Up close his tusks were chipped, his ears ragged from 100 fights, but his eyes, God help me, his eyes held something like relief. As though he'd been afraid no one else would hear that drowning voice. I thought, he's done his part. Now he'll charge me or bolt into the brush, and this will all end in blood or in disbelief. I thought that was the end of it, that nature had shown her hand and would fade back into the myth she came from. But the marsh had another twist waiting for me, and it would change everything I believed about wild things. I kept yelling, half to scare the hog off, half to keep my own courage from slipping away. Go on now. My voice cracked, but the boar didn't budge. He only shifted one heavy step back, lifted his head, and locked those dark eyes on mine. No snarl, no flare of rage, just a hard, waiting stare, like a man at a crossroads who needs you to hurry up and choose. That was when the truth stabbed through the fog. Somebody was trapped down there, and the animal knew it better than I did. I edged closer, boots squelching. The sinkhole gurgled, thick as tar. A pale shape glimmered beneath the surface. My stomach flipped, an arm. Mud painted it the color of old coffee grounds. The hand twitched once, then slipped deeper. The stranger's face bobbed up next, coated in slime, eyes fluttering like moth wings. He gasped a breath that sounded more like a rattle. Fear slapped me first, raw, electric. A man drowning within reach and a tusked brute beside him? Wrong place, wrong morning. Then the shock hit. This hog ain't leaving. He was still there because he wanted something done. And right behind the shock came a rush of gratitude so strong it almost buckled my knees. I wasn't alone against the swamp itself had sent me help. The boar thrust forward again, clamping his jaws on the back of the kid's denim jacket. He heaved, rear legs digging trenches in the peat. The fabric ripped with a sound like splitting canvas. I lurched in, grabbed the man by the belt with one hand, the shoulder seam with the other, and yanked in time with the boar's next pull. Mud frothed over my wrists, cold and stinging. The kid slid an inch, then another. The hole sucked harder. I lost footing, dropped to one knee, and for a heartbeat thought we'd both be hauled under. The hog braced sideways, throwing his weight against the suction exactly when I did. It felt like wrestling alongside some giant farmhand who understood every grunt I made before I made it. Little by little the stranger's torso rose, sludge sloughing away to reveal a college-age kid in a soaked plaid shirt, freckles lost under the grime. "Hang on, son," I muttered, not sure if he could hear. His eyelids flickered, a thin moan seeped out. Final surge, we hauled him clear, collapsing backward onto a hummock of ragweed. The boar let go, wheezed, and stepped aside, legs trembling. Steam poured off his hide in the cold dawn. I leaned over the kid, 2 fingers at his neck. Weak pulse, but it was there. Chest barely lifting. Alive. That's when the moment carved itself into my bones. I looked up and the boar was standing next to us, shoulders heaving, ribs pumping like bellows. His head hung low and those small eyes stayed fixed on the boy's face, not mine. In their shine was something I have no better word for than worry. I saw the boar standing beside him, breathing hard as if he was afraid we wouldn't make it in time. I fumbled my phone out, cursing the mud on the screen, and stabbed at 911. Signal danced in and out, each bar winking like a cruel firefly. Through it all, the animal never flinched, never shuffled to charge or to flee. He simply listened to the gurgle of the victim's breaths the way a mother listens to a sick child. A shaky connection clicked through. I spit coordinates, voice shaking, begged them to send an airboat. The dispatcher kept asking me to repeat and spell the Bayou Road. I kept one eye on the hog, ready for him to lose patience. But he didn't. He just sank back on his haunches, nostrils quivering, waiting. Minutes crawled. I ripped my jacket off, balled it under the kid's head, tried to brush muck out of his mouth. Each time I moved, the boar's ears twitched, but he held his ground like some grim guardian statue carved out of living muscle. And then, not sure why, I reached out and laid a muddy hand on the boar's shoulder. The bristles were coarse, warm, trembling beneath the skin. He didn't jerk away. For a breath we just existed there, a broken old fisherman, a half-dead stranger, and a creature most folks call vermin stitched together by something none of us could name. Far off, an engine coughed, a rescue coming at last. Tires over planks, voices shouting. The boar's head jerked toward the sound. He sniffed, gave one forlorn grunt, and backed into the reeds, vanishing before the first flashlight beam sliced the mist. I thought he'd just leave after that. I figured the wild always retreats once the human world shows up with sirens and stretchers. I couldn't have guessed that was only the start and that the marsh had another secret waiting, one that would chase sleep from my nights for years to come. I stabbed at my phone again, nothing but one shivering bar that blinked away whenever the wind shifted. Come on, I hissed, wiping swamp scum off the screen with the back of my hand. The boy at my feet wheezed like an accordion starved of air. And the boar just sat there beside him, chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate drags as if he'd settled in for an all-night vigil. No huffing, no stomping, no threat. Just waiting. I tried a different angle, climbed a hummock for a few inches of height, still garbled static. I could taste panic in the back of my throat. Every rule I'd ever learned about wild hogs said turn tail when you can. But leaving that kid alone with the swamp, even with this half-tamed guardian, felt wrong in a way my bones wouldn't allow. So I went back down and knelt again. The hog's ears twitched at my approach, but he didn't flinch. I reached out, slow as prayer, and let him sniff my fingers. He drew one long breath in, the wet leather of his nose brushing my knuckles, then released it like a weary sigh. There was no anger in him, only a strange, measured assurance. Go on, those tiny dark eyes seemed to say. Finish what you started. Fear cracked and slid away, replaced by a respect so sharp it left me lightheaded. I'd grown up hunting these creatures, knowing them as reckless, mean. Yet here was a brute who guarded a stranger the way a hound guards its master's boots. The world tilted, nothing felt certain except the boy's pulse fluttering under my thumb and the beast's broad flank pressed close enough to warm the damp air between us. The kid coughed, spitting mud. I tilted his head, cleared his mouth. The hog edged nearer, shoulder nudging my knee as if urging, keep going. His coarse hide scraped my jeans. It wasn't gentle, but it was oddly encouraging. I spoke without thinking. I'm trying, big fella, I'm trying. Hearing my own voice steadied me. Somewhere across the water a motor sputtered awake, the search and rescue John boat. Relief surged so hard I laughed, a cracked, breathless sound. The boar's head turned toward the noise, nostrils flaring, but he didn't stir. He just sat straighter, almost proud, eyes fixed on the boy. Minutes later the aluminum hull clanged against the cypress roots. Flashlights speared the mist. Over here, I bellowed. 2 EMTs and a deputy splashed up the bank, radios crackling, life vests squeaking. Their beams froze when they saw the hog. Sir, move away from the animal, the deputy barked, hand drifting toward his sidearm. He's not the danger, I shot back. The kid is. The boar rose but only backed up 3 slow steps, hooves suctioning in the mud. He didn't charge, didn't vanish. He simply took a guard post at the edge of the clearing and watched. Watched the medics kneel, slap a mask over the boy's face, check pupils with a penlight. Watched the deputy call in coordinates. Watched them strap the limp body to a board, mud dripping like candle wax off his boots. When the rescuers arrived, he stepped back, but he didn't run. He just watched them take the boy away as if making sure everything was truly all right. The EMTs carried the stretcher toward the boat. The hog's gaze followed every inch. His breathing slowed, almost peaceful now that the burden was off his shoulders. I found myself whispering, he's safe. You did it. Silly thing to say to a creature that couldn't understand English, except part of me was certain he did. The stretcher clattered onto the deck, the motor revved. Spray hissed behind the prop. I expected the boar to vanish into the reeds then, but he lingered, shoulders easing only when the boat's red top light faded into the fog. Silence rushed in, thick and humming. I bent to grab my forgotten shotgun, mud-caked, useless, then looked back. The boar met my stare one last time. Something passed between us, a quiet pact sealed without words. He turned, muscles rippling under the moon-pale bristles, and melted into the cattails, leaving nothing but quivering stalks in his wake. I stood alone, heart drumming, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or drop to my knees. The marsh smelled different now, less like decay, more like possibility. A breeze rippled across the flats, and in it I heard the smallest echo of that hog's steady breathing. I figured that was the end of the miracle, that nature had closed her ledger and balanced the account. But dawn was still hours off, and the bayou isn't known for letting debts rest unpaid, not when there's one more truth waiting to break a man wide open. The rescue boat's engine faded until it was just another hush in the night. Red strobes vanished beyond the cypress, carrying that boy toward doctors and bright lights. I should have followed, file a report, answer questions, do the sensible civilized thing, but my boots stayed sunk to the ankles in mud, nailed there by something older than sense. The boar was still here. He stood at the edge of the sinkhole, shoulder to shoulder with the dark, staring down into the churned-up muck as if the ground itself could replay what we'd just lived through. Fog draped his spine, moonlight silvered the wet bristles along his flanks. He didn't grunt, didn't scratch, didn't so much as flick an ear. He simply watched the place where a life had almost ended. I cleared my throat. "It's over now, partner," I said, the way a man might speak to another man after a graveside prayer. The words sounded foolish hanging in the reeds, but they were all I had. "You did good." He angled his head, one eye catching mine. There was no flash of wildness, no warning. Only that same stern, weary patience I'd seen when he refused to run. It pinned me harder than any tusk could have. I thought of stepping back, of letting nature reclaim her mystery, but each time my heel lifted, something hitched behind my ribs. A tug, faint but impossible to ignore. The same tug that makes a compass needle quiver north. I took another breath of marsh air and felt it settle certain. I am not done here. So instead of leaving, I trudged closer, just 2 careful steps. The boar didn't retreat. He turned away from the hole and faced me proper, then lowered himself, front knees first, rear haunches folding, until he lay in the grass like a farmhouse dog easing onto the porch boards after supper. The breath I'd been holding tumbled out of me in a shaky half-laugh. "Well, ain't you full of surprises?" I murmured. Moonlight swept across his face. The scar on his snout glowed pale, a jagged crescent. My chest tightened. There was a hoglet I once freed from a snare 20-odd years back. Left a matching cut when the wire snapped. My mind tried to shake the notion away, but my heart clenched around it like a secret it had been hunting for years. Something warm pooled behind my eyes. I lowered myself a few yards away and sat cross-legged, shotgun across my lap but forgotten. The night pressed close, thick with mud scent and magnolia. No crickets sang, no frogs chimed. Only the distant slap of water against cypress knees. Minutes drifted. The boar's breathing evened into a slow, rolling rhythm. I followed each rise and fall, letting it stitch my own pulse into calm. Out here, 2 creatures who should have feared each other shared a hush that city folk would pay fortunes to feel. After a while I spoke again, voice low. "You know, folks won't believe a lick of this. They'll say I'm touched or drunk." The hog twitched one ear, as though half offended I'd doubt what we'd both seen. "Doesn't matter," I went on. "I believe it, and I reckon that's enough." A cloud slid past the moon. The clearing dimmed. The boar's outline merged with shadow until he was more idea than animal. A silent oath carved out of dark. My breath slowed to match his, and in that steady cadence another truth slipped in. Somewhere along the line, the swamp had flipped the script. I came here thinking I was caretaker of nets and catch. Turns out the marsh already had a caretaker, and he wore bristles instead of badges. He looked at me like an old friend I'd forgotten I had, and the weight of that gaze squeezed tears I didn't know I carried. Wind rustled the cattails. Instinct nagged. "Get home before dawn, old man." I pushed to my feet. Mud popped around my boots. "I should go," I told him. He didn't stir. I took 3 steps toward the trail, then glanced back, and felt that compass tug snap taut again. Couldn't leave him there, not yet. So I turned around, came back, and lowered myself beside him once more. We sat like that, 2 silhouettes stitched to the earth, until the moon dipped and purple seeped into the eastern haze. Only then did the boar rise, stretch slow, and give a grunt so soft it felt like goodbye. He took a single pace toward the tree line, and stopped, waiting, as if granting me the final choice. My throat closed. "Go on," I whispered. "I'll be all right." The words tasted like surrender and blessing all at once. He walked into the reeds without hurry, each step parting stalks with a sigh. When the last ripple of grass had stilled, the marsh exhaled, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for hours. I figured that would be the moment he vanished for good, back into whatever legend had birthed him. I reckoned wrong. The bayou wasn't done rewriting everything I thought I knew about debt and memory and the strange, fierce kindness that lives under a swine's hide. Dawn bled over the bayou in slow, lavender streaks, but I still hadn't moved from that spit of ground. My legs were numb, my mind raw, yet a strange warmth floated in my chest, half shock, half something holier. I watched the place where the boar had disappeared, and a memory, long buried under years of fish guts and bills, clawed its way up. I was 22, fresh home from the service, stubborn as a cypress root. One spring morning I found a squealing piglet caught in a barbed wire snare someone had set for coons. The little thing thrashed itself bloody, eyes wild with terror. I should have left it. Everyone told me hogs were pests, but something about that frantic heartbeat fit my palm like a promise. I cut the wire, packed mud on the cut to stop the bleeding, and let the piglet totter off. I never told a soul. Seemed too small a deed to brag on. For years afterward, every hog track I saw in these parts carried a sliver of that morning, though I buried the feeling beneath work and weather. Now, kneeling here in this same stretch of marsh, the old scene replayed bright as sunrise, and a whisper slid down my spine. What if it's him? Ridiculous. Boars don't remember men. 20+ seasons of hurricanes, hunters, and lean winters lie between a half-grown shote and the mountain of muscle that pulled a stranger from death. Yet the scar, white and jagged in the same place where barbed wire bit that piglet, wouldn't leave my mind. Coincidence, my brain insisted. Fate, my heartbeat answered. A soft rustle snapped me back. Reeds parted and the boar emerged again, moon-pale bristles gilded now by sunrise gold. He walked straight toward me, deliberate, unstoppable as tidewater. I should have stood, backed up, shown respect or fear. Instead I stayed rooted like a child waiting for a verdict he can't predict. He halted a yard away. Steam curled from his nostrils. Our eyes met over the mud-scarred ground, and in that silent gaze the bayou itself seemed to hush. There was no challenge there, no wild glitter. Only a depth that reached past instinct into something I'd once thought belonged to people alone. In his eyes was something I know I will carry to my grave. It was gratitude. A tremor rippled through me. Knees shook, breath fluttered, heart hammered as if trying to carve an answer in my ribs. This can't be real, thought clanged. But you just saw it, soul replied. I whispered, was it you, boy? That little fella I let go? My throat burned. The boar flicked one ear, then slow as moss, swayed his head side to side, emotion so close to a knot it shattered the last wall of disbelief. Tears I didn't approve of spilled warm down my cheeks. I laughed, choked, wiped grime across my face, made a mess of everything, and still the beast watched with a patience gentler than any sermon I've heard. The sun crested the pines. Light pooled on his scar, turning it to molten copper. I saw it clear now. The world had looped a thread between two beings most folks say should hate each other and tied it so tight neither distance nor years could fray it. The marsh, it seemed, keeps receipts. Words stumbled out before I knew what I meant to say. Thank you for coming back, for saving that boy, for showing me I'm not alone in owing debts. The boar's ears relaxed. A rumble blossomed low in his chest, not a growl, more a purr run through a gravel chute. It rolled over me like warm tidewater, and for one fragile breath I believed creation itself might be listening. My pulse pounded so loud I could feel it in my fingertips. If anybody had walked up right then, old buddies, wildlife wardens, the governor himself, I'd have grabbed them by the shoulders and shouted the truth. We are seen by what we call wild, and sometimes, if we're blessed, we are remembered. A gust stirred the cattails. The boar looked toward the treeline, time to go. He shifted his weight, but before turning, he dipped his head once, deliberate, deeper than any salute. My vision blurred again. I blinked, the tears clear, and the boar was already retreating, merging with the dawn haze until he was nothing but the echo of hooves in wet earth. Silence settled, thick, reverent. I pressed a palm to the ground, half expecting to feel the heartbeat of the bayou itself. Impossible? Maybe. But I saw it. I felt it. And from this day on, no sunrise over these waters will ever look ordinary again. I went back at first light, boots still caked from the night before, heart humming with impossible hope. The marsh looked untouched, cattails bending in slow prayer, fog curling low over the sinkhole that had almost become a grave. I stood there a long while, waiting for a ripple of bristles or the grunt that had already carved itself into my dreams. Nothing. Just wind and water and my own pulse. Loss hit hard, sharp as winter eelgrass. Yet beneath it ran a strange fullness, a peace like warm river mud between bare toes. I wasn't afraid of this place anymore, not of the shadows, not of what they hide. The bayou had shown me its fiercest face and its gentlest in one breath, and somehow that made every hush feel like welcome. Back in town, the story spilled out of me the way a net spills mullet on a dock, messy, urgent, undeniable. The bait shop boys chuckled behind their chew, called it a swamp dream brewed from cheap whiskey. The deputy who'd drawn his sidearm said he must have misremembered the distance. Folks nodded, relief softening their eyes, easier to believe the old man had cracked than to rewrite the law of tooth and tusk. Only one voice backed mine, the young fellow we pulled out, pale but smiling under hospital sheets. When I visited, he gripped my wrist with mud-scarred fingers and whispered, I saw him, big red face in the fog, thought I was hallucinating. Those words lit a hearth in my chest nothing could dim. Walking home that evening, I noticed things I'd never truly seen. A heron tracked my stride along the shoreline, head tilting as though weighing my worth. A pair of otters surfaced, stared a heartbeat longer than curiosity allows, then slipped away in perfect silence. Even the mosquitoes seemed to hover at arm's length, undecided. It struck me then, animals look at us the way mirrors never do. They measure the noise inside, the kindness we forget we carry, the debts we have yet to pay. A year ago, I walked these banks certain I ranked above the wild by virtue of thumbs and talk. Now every set of watching eyes felt like an invitation to earn my place. Loneliness washed over me, crisp and cold, then rolled back, leaving a tideline of connection so wide I could rest inside it. Peace followed on quiet feet. That night, porch boards creaked beneath my rocker, cicadas drummed like far-off rain. I thought of the boar where he bedded down, whether he felt the same hush I did. I pictured him nose-deep in acorns, sun on his scar, and the thought seeded comfort instead of longing. Some meetings, I realized, aren't meant to be repeated. They're stitched once into a man's marrow and left to glow there, steady as lighthouse coal. Friends kept asking why I smiled at nothing, why I hummed between stories, why the rifle stayed hanging over the mantel untouched. I told them the marsh had changed flavors, and if they wanted to taste it, they'd have to come listen for themselves. Most shook their heads. A few followed me out, boots crunching, curiosity poking through disbelief. None of them saw the boar, but every single one stepped lighter on the way back, as though afraid to bruise the place. Weeks passed. Headlines moved on, the boy healed, summer rolled into the heavy breath of August. My tale settled into rumor, one more bayou yarn told at dusk. Yet some evenings, when the sky purples and the wind hushes, I catch a scent of warm earth and remember the weight of bristles against my knee. My chest swells until it almost hurts, and I whisper thanks into the dark. People think miracles crash loud like thunder. I've learned they sometimes sit beside you in quiet mud, share your labor, and vanish before sunrise, leaving only the echo of their patience inside your ribs. I used to walk these banks hunting proof that the world was mine to master. Now I walk them listening for a breath that isn't human, ready to answer when it calls. The wild hasn't changed. I have. And the change tastes sweet like well water after a season of salt. I'll keep the porch light low, the door unlatched, in case another impossible debt comes looking for payment. Until then I'll rock and watch and carry that meeting like a warm coal under my tongue, a secret beacon for whatever kindness still prowls the shadows. Because once a creature of the swamp looks at you and sees something worth saving, you can't help but try to become the man he already thought you were. Some evenings, when the heat slips off the pines and the frogs strike up their ragged choir, I take the long path to the bayou just to sit where mud met miracle. I bring no rifle, no nets, only a tin cup of coffee and the hush inside my chest. Folks ask why an old fisherman wastes time watching fog. They don't feel what I feel, a steady gaze pressing through the cattails, gentle as a hand on the shoulder. Every step toward that water tells me somebody's keeping score of my footprints. The first months after the rescue, I fought the feeling, turned quick, swung a flashlight, tried to catch eyes glinting back. Nothing. But the sense never faded. It rode the air like the sweet rot of lilies, telling me I was not alone on those banks. In place of fear, it planted a strange comfort. If I stumbled, if the swamp ever decided to take me, something out there would notice. So I made a habit of it. Sunset, thermos rocking on a cypress root while minnows stitched rings around my boots. No baited lines, no hunt. Just waiting. Most nights delivered nothing but wind and mosquito hum. Some brought curious raccoons, a heron angry at my stillness, the distant slap of a gator's tail. Yet behind every ordinary rustle lay the same quiet certainty: he's near. One gray dawn, thick with gulf mist, the air changed. I felt it first in my lungs, like breathing through wool. The coffee stayed untouched, my hands forgot the cup existed. Across the shallows a shape gathered, broad, low, edged by bristle. Not moving forward, not backing off. Simply standing where fog folds into itself. Heart thudded once, hard. I didn't rise. Didn't speak. The shape remained solid, anchored, but blurred as memory. I knew those lines even through the blur. The scarred ridge of a snout, the slope of shoulders built to uproot stumps. Distance between us hardly 20 yards, yet it felt wide as a life. Minutes passed, could have been 10, could have been 1. Cicadas clicked, then fell silent, as if the whole marsh held its breath. My throat worked, but the words jammed behind caution and awe. Finally, I pushed them out, soft, shaking. The silhouette didn't flinch. Mist coiled around him like slow smoke, hiding and revealing by turns, the way truth hides inside a man's days and only shows when his heart stops blinking. He gave no grunt, no stomp. Just waited, the same patience that held that boy's life above the mire months ago. A wave of gratitude rolled through me so fierce my eyes burned. I wanted to bridge the distance, lay a hand on that scar, prove to skin and bone that the world can keep a promise across decades. But I stayed put. Some distances are holy, meant to be honored, not crossed. Instead I spoke again, voice steadier. You did more than save a life, friend. You saved the part of me that quit believing men and beasts still share ground. Wind rattled cane grass, an answer, or maybe just wind. The silhouette remained. I told him about the boy, now walking without crutches. How he plans to plant trees along the levee because nature gave me one. I told him the deputy quit trapping hogs for sport. Swears the marsh deserves respect. I even confessed the guilt that chews me when I remember younger hunts. How quick I was to pull a trigger on any back bristled and rooting. Words spilled like creek water after rain, and the fog listened. At last the shape lifted its head, ears pricking forward. He shifted one massive hoof, then another, turning not toward the trees but deeper into the misted water where moon and mud meet. Each step was slow, soundless. He paused once, brief, deliberate, letting me trace his outline one final time, branding it behind my eyes. Then the fog swallowed him whole. Silence rushed in, thick enough to taste. I realized my fists were clenched around nothing. I opened them and they shook. Tears, quiet, unannounced, slid down to the corners of my mouth. I breathed marsh air laced with gratitude and felt it steady the tremor. Those words settled on the water like oil, widening until they touched every dock, every kayak, every crawfish pot strung through my memory. My life before this moment suddenly looked paper-thin. Every sunrise after felt thick enough to hold. When the fog thinned and morning painted the cattails gold, I rose. The bank looked ordinary again. Mud, water, footprints already filling with seepage. Yet something bright pulsed in the middle of that plain scene, invisible to any camera. Cord. A bond. Call it grace, call it debt, call it whatever lets you sleep. I call it proof that wild things carry hearts big enough to lend us beats when our own sputter. Back in town, I still hear chuckles when the story surfaces. That's fine. A miracle doesn't mind being doubted. It just minds being forgotten. I keep telling it, because every retelling lays one more plank between men and the pitying ignorance we mistake for knowledge. Now and then strangers drive out, curious, hopeful. They ask where it happened. I guide them to the bank, bid them hush, let the marsh speak or stay silent. Some leave disappointed. Others leave quiet, eyes softer, as though they heard a faint breath just beyond hearing. Me, I'll keep carrying my thermos and sitting at water's edge till my legs quit. Not waiting for another rescue, just honoring the first. And if one dawn a familiar silhouette rises again in the fog, I'll nod, the way old friends nod when words are too small. Because once you've seen Mercy wearing bristles, every ripple of the bayou feels like a heartbeat you didn't know the world could spare.